Welcome to Midweek at the Compass. My name's Jake, and we are in the midst of our sermon series called Egypt, A Line in the Sand. You know, today as we were preparing for our podcast, we were just looking through the scriptural stories that we find in 2 Kings. And there's two stories back to back. There's one about Josiah and another about Jehoahaz. And as we were sitting here processing of what would make the most sense, we just landed on the fact that we want to take a few moments to talk about Josiah and some of the verses specifically that we find in this 2 Kings account. So we're going to have a conversation. I'm joined today by Cassie Hayes. Cassie, hi.
Hello, Jake.
For those of you that aren't yet aware, Cassie and I work together here at Compass Online. She is the one who is making all of this happen anymore. So thank you, first of all, for that. Of
course, my pleasure.
It's been a joy.
Thanks.
So take a few moments, introduce yourself, say a little bit more about who you are, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I'm Cassie, as you said. I'm mom to 4 kids. Our oldest is 14. We have an 11-year-old boy, a 10-year-old girl, and our youngest is a 5-year-old little boy, just started kindergarten, so we've got a wide spectrum. And my husband Alex and I have been married for 16 years. We live in Cary, Illinois, so we're a little far away from you guys, but yeah.
But you still make it down at least once a week, and it's good.
It's fun.
It's good. So if you don't mind, I'm going to start out by reading just kind of the passage that you and I were brainstorming around and felt like it'd be a good one to have a conversation with. So I'm going to pick it up here. It's in 2 Kings chapter 23. And in verse 25, it says that neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to the Lord as he did, with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength, in accordance with all the law of Moses. It's really interesting passage when you sit down and actually think about it, right? Yeah. Because when it's saying that there was no king before or after, it's really fascinating to think that, like, as Christians, we think of David and his story and how David was a man after God's own heart and all of these different things. And yet we're seeing here that there was nobody before or after who did things the way that Josiah did.
Yeah.
So I'd love to just start it out by asking you a question. Cassie, what does it look like in your life to follow the Lord with all of your heart and with all of your soul?
Yeah, I would say first, it's looked different in every season of my life. So there was a season in college where I had, not a lot of responsibilities other than studying, and I did a lot of Bible study. And so it was a lot of me sitting down with my Bible and unpacking and journaling and praying and asking God for clarification on what some of the passages meant. I had a lot of new revelations in that season, and the Bible was just kind of opened up to me in a new way. So then after we got married and had kids, it looked a lot different because, you have little kids running around. They're always needing something. So there was a season where we had 3 kids under 5, and the 2 practices that I feel like I leaned into the most were just prayer amongst my day. So if I was making dinner, I'd be praying. If the kids were being really loud and I was like on my last thread of patience, I'd be praying, Lord, please give me some more patience. Please help me to love my kids the way that you love them. And the other one was I found a holy space actually at my kitchen sink. So after the kids would go to bed at night was kind of my time to, clean up the storm of messes that they had made. And part of that was doing dishes. And so I'd stand at the kitchen sink and put on some worship music. And that really became like a holy moment and a holy practice for me, was to be there doing the dishes and just do it unto the Lord and try to be grateful that I had dishes to clean instead of being frustrated that there were so many of them to do. So, yeah.
That's a really interesting thing, too, because I don't know if you're even aware of it, but our senior pastor, Jeff Griffin, has talked regularly about this guy named Brother Lawrence and has mentioned on more than one occasion, like he was a monk, I believe, and his job was washing dishes. And he did the exact same thing that you were doing, right? Like it's, how can I do this to the best of my ability? How can I honor God through what I'm doing? How can I connect with God through a task even like washing dishes?
Yeah, I think it's in Colossians, that verse that says, everything that you do, do it unto the Lord. And I think it's that posture of keeping God at the center, and really what it looks like to follow God with all of our hearts and all of our souls is to really remember that everything that he's put in front of us to do, we have a choice, right? We can choose to try to do it out of our own power, or we can choose to do it unto him and really surrender it and be obedient and trust that if he's put it in front of us to do that, he's put it in front of us for a reason. And so we get to choose to honor him in that way. And that's kind of a form of worship. So,
yeah. I'm going to turn it my way with this a little bit, because I was sitting here thinking, like, how would I say that I am honoring the Lord and worshiping him with all of my heart and all of my soul? And I would agree that it's looked different in different seasons. I remember like the first time that I was serving in church regularly, outside of running the transparencies. For those of you that don't know what transparencies
awesome.
are, that just means I'm a dinosaur, and I get it, and that's okay. But it's what you had to put the lyrics for the worship songs on, and you had to slide it up as you were singing. And when you went back to the chorus, you'd slide it back down. It's an overhead projector. Whatever. That's okay.
For you youngins out there, it's like similar to a smart board these days.
I don't know what a smart board is. So, man, that's bad. And that's okay. But shortly after that, right, the first place I would say that I truly plugged in serving was on the worship team. So for me, connecting with God and worshiping with all of my heart and with all of my soul, and honoring God with all of my heart and all of my soul, meant that I was doing it from up front, that it was on a stage, that I was leading worship, singing, playing guitar, all of the things that I, looking back, probably wasn't always doing for the best reasons. But I do like to think, mixed in with all of them, that I was doing that for very God-honoring reasons. And that season extended even to here at Compass. Like, I started serving in student ministries pretty early on, and it's something where really quickly I took that over and was able to serve on the worship team for students, and then serve on the worship team for weekend services and all of that. So to me, it kind of tied into that specific aspect of it, but it wasn't really like a whole life posture.
Right.
And that's where probably about 2.5 years ago at this point, I read a book that's been something that I've probably reread about 4 times at this point, and it's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer.
Good one.
And it's one that it resonated with me, and it's because I realized that I wasn't doing the things that really would be benefiting my soul, that would actually be honoring God with all of my heart and all of my soul, as opposed to just a small aspect of how I'd been wired.
Right. So what does that look like for you now?
It looks really different than it used to. The first thing that comes to mind is, we're going to call them spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices, but really just realizing like I wasn't doing hardly any of them. And when I wasn't doing them with the right heart posture.
That's good.
The first thing that I would say of how I've learned to honor God with all my heart and soul lately is by actually taking a Sabbath. I've been terrible at that over the course of my life. And I'll own it to the fact that I've worked a job since I was 6 years old. And have not had a time where I haven't worked since then. I was a paper boy, right? Like, it's not like it was a super complicated job. But because of it, like I've worked multiple jobs for long stretches and seasons of my life. And I was able to justify it of, well, I don't feel burnt out. I don't feel like I need a break. I can keep powering through. And really, it came to a realization, and it was, again, because I was reading that particular book, where it was not only the fact that, one, God modeled it, and if he modeled the fact that we need to take time to rest, how much more should I be doing it?
Yeah, absolutely.
But it also was the realization that when I was looking at that account, the day of Sabbath, like, is the only of those 7-day accounts in Genesis where it didn't have an end point of it. Like every other day, it's like it was this day and this was the 6th day. And on the 7th day, it's just that God rested. And like, it should be baked into everything that we're doing.
Right.
So it's been, man, how do I become intentional of not working through my Sabbath?
Yeah.
And also not becoming legalistic about it?
Totally. Yeah.
So it's been I try and take Fridays off, and it doesn't always work. And when it doesn't work, I won't turn on a computer on Saturday because I know myself.
Yep.
And I know that if I turn it on, that it's naturally going to lead itself to working.
Yeah, you're going to get sucked in.
Really quickly.
Yep.
Some alert will go off, or I'll see a message come through, and it's like, oh yeah, I can check that email. And then 3 hours later, I
Yep.
have a problem.
I can relate to that. Yeah.
But it's also been, man, I need to work on Sabbath moments as much as
Yes.
Sabbath days.
Yeah.
How much am I taking an hour out of my life to shut off my phone? Or what can I do to leave all of my technology, like that's the thing that sucks me in the worst, in a different room so I can spend dedicated time with my wife and not be distracted and not be thinking about anything else. Like, how can I honor her
Yeah.
because I'm taking a Sabbath moment?
Yeah, that's so good. That was, there's a pastor from Michigan named Jeff Mannion, and that was the first time that I had heard that idea of taking kind of Sabbath moments or incorporating it into your week and not being legalistic that it has to be on Sunday, which was super mind-blowing as someone working in ministry, right? Because usually you are working on a Sunday. And so to be intentional about that practice. And he said that he and his wife would take like Friday mornings and they would just walk through their little small town and leave their technology behind, and that was their Sabbath. And so I think especially in our culture that's so busy, the more that we can create those little pockets intentionally, that's why I don't mind driving an hour here, because I do often take that time in my car to be a Sabbath and just like, okay, I'm just gonna sit and pray as I'm driving, as much as I can still stay focused on the road and be safe. But yeah, the other thing about Sabbath that really kind of wrecked me was somebody said that taking a Sabbath is actually you trusting that it's not all about you and that God is going to work while you're not working.
Right.
Right. And so when I started looking at it like that if I'm not taking Sabbath, I'm actually not trusting God to do his job, and I'm trying to do what only he can do. That was like a game changer for me.
Yeah, it's like we feel like everything depends on us to do it, when we realize like every good and perfect thing and everything, like it comes from God.
Yeah.
So if we can't feel like we can take a break and trust him to keep the world moving while we relax for an hour, like shame on us.
Exactly.
And I won't go into all sorts. Like there are so many spiritual practices and disciplines that we could talk about. There's like confession and repentance, reflection, solitude.
Yeah.
But another one that I've wrestled with, and it's because it came with a little bit of baggage for me personally, is fasting.
Yeah.
And it's one where it's become trendy again because of intermittent fasting.
That's true. Yeah.
But it's one of those.
Fasting for different reasons.
Yeah. And I'm not talking about fasting for losing weight, and I'm not, right? Like, and some people will use fasting specifically for like a technology break or whatever. And I think there's validity to all of that. But when we look through the gospel accounts and we see when Jesus is talking about fasting, if you're physically able to, I don't want to overstep any bounds there, but it's why are we doing it? Like, and it's to make sure that one, our body is a temple and that we continue to work it into submission. But also the reliance that God will give us what we need when we need it. And it's a reminder that even though I'm hungry, I don't need food desperately in that moment, right? I live the privileged North American life. So why wouldn't I expect that God is still going to provide all my needs? If he provides for the sparrows, right, and the birds, like how much more is he going to for us?
Yeah.
But the other end of things that, again, I'm going to credit John Mark Comer for it in a different book. I feel like I'm geeking out a little bit with it here, but fasting's a really interesting thing too. Like, there's a real interesting tie when it comes to fasting and sin patterns in our life. And just how we can look to, how can we look to overcome a certain area of sin, physical, emotional, whatever the case is, if we can't overcome our own personal bent and desire for just putting food in our stomach.
Right.
And he goes into a whole lot more detail that I won't necessarily try and eloquently put, but it's called Live No Lies if anybody's interested in it. I agree with most of the book, and it's one of those, the point in there was so valid that it was eye-opening for me of when's the last time I've fasted outside of Lent in that season. And honestly, when it's even that season, I'm giving up like caffeine, or I'm giving up TV for a week. But what am I doing to regularly spend time fasting from food so that I have more time to intentionally pray?
Yeah. I similarly just didn't really know much about fasting until I was an adult, to be honest. And someone said to me that, when you're fasting from food, it's like every time you're feeling hungry or feeling that desire to go to food or coffee or whatever it is for you, that you're turning your attention to God instead in prayer. And so then you're literally living out the practice of relying on Him and Him alone. So it makes me think of that verse that says, right, we do not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. And so really getting into that discipline, like you said, of putting Him first, and even with what we eat and how we choose to spend our time. So, yeah.
And I want to go to another part of that verse really quick, right? We talked here a little bit, and there, like I said, you can go to countless spiritual disciplines. Pete Sutton and I talked about them on a midweek previous to it even being a podcast. I'm sure it's somewhere on our YouTube channel still as well. Did a whole series on that in particular. But we talked about following with all of our heart and with all of our soul, but we didn't talk about what it looks like to honor the Lord with all of our strength.
Yeah. You
As
have some thoughts about
mom,
that? Oh.
How do you honor God with your strength?
Yeah, you know what? Actually, I think it's taking care of my body. And I think it's so easy as parents, whether you're a mom or a dad, to put everyone else first. And so for me, I want to make sure, you mentioned it earlier, like our body is a temple, right? If I'm not taking care of my body, that means getting enough rest. That means not eating junk all the time. That means limiting my sugar intake, or everybody's body is different, but you have to learn what it is for you and really put those practices into play. Sometimes that for me is, going to bed a little bit earlier than I anticipated, even if there are still dishes in the sink, or things that should have been done or that I wanted to get done on my to-do list. And so making sure that I'm taking care of myself, because if I'm not, then I'm going to be trying to take care of everybody else out of an empty bucket. So if I want to serve God with my entire strength, I need to make sure that I'm making sure that I am strong, right? So for some people that might be exercising or whatever that is, to really build up your physical endurance so that you can actually do what God's asking you to do. Because if you're not taking care of your body, you're going to be tired and burnt out and stressed, and that's really not helpful for anybody. So
you can only run on caffeine for so long.
That's true. It's true. What about for you, Jake?
Serving the Lord with all of my strength. To me, I go straight to one of our church's 4 priorities, and that's to serve in teams, right? When I think about what it looks like to honor God with my strength, it's physically doing something, and whether that's something I'm really gifted in or really passionate about, or the times where it's something where I'm not really gifted in, right? I am not handy. I can't build anything to save my life. If something breaks in our house, we might just have to move and sell it because that's just not how I've been wired. It's not how God's made me. And yet, God's called me at different times. At missions trips is a great example, like to roll up my sleeves and physically do something.
Yeah, it's good.
But you see God at work when you do things like that, right? Like when you decide to jump in at Compass Kids and say that I'm going to serve with all of my strength, you're saying that God, the people that you love are in my midst. So I'm going to give all of the energy that you have given me and pour it into these kids. And I'm going to let you do the work that you can only do, but I'm going to do things to the best of my ability until I can't do it anymore. Because God, I want to honor you. I want people to know how good you are because of how I've acted and treated other people. And I want people to have great experiences and come to know you for the first time because I've been willing to say yes when you've called me to do hard things.
Right.
And I think a lot of times we would rather serve only when it's easy or convenient.
Yes. Or comfortable.
Or comfortable. And I don't see that anywhere, right?
It's not exactly how Jesus did it.
Yeah. I would love it to be like, Jake, the only time you have to ever serve is by leading worship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when I was younger, I would have said, great, I can do that and I could do it all day.
Mm-hmm.
But when God says, okay, but mixed in with that, I actually also want you to serve by going on this trip, or I want you to serve in your home, or I want you to serve by taking a half day off and actually, being with your kids. Like,
Right.
there are so many different areas where God's called us to serve with our strength that I think is really fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's really good to know, like, it's a whole body experience sometimes to serve and honor God. Like, we do it with our heart and our emotions, but we also do it with our body and our strength and the physical things that we can actually do to help connect people to a God who loves them.
Yeah, that's so good. I think it's important too, if we are feeling tired and haven't been taking care of our body, to just remember we can pause to pray before we are entering into that serving experience, right? I've done that a few times where our third daughter, our third child, and I will serve in our disability ministry on Sundays for our second service. And sometimes there have been a few weeks where I'm like, oh Lord, I am so tired. Like, please just help me get through this, And those times actually sometimes are the ones that are the most filling up for me. And so just that obedience of doing what, again, God has put in front of you to do, and showing up physically, and even, again, if you're feeling drained or anything, to just give it back to God and pray before you enter that experience. Then He can give you His strength, even if you feel like you don't have any. So
that's the best kind of strength to have,
it
too.
Totally is, yeah.
So we focused on one verse, but there's a second verse, like right after it, that I'd love for us to dive into a little bit as well.
Let's do it.
So we talked about how Josiah turned to the Lord, and with it was all his heart and with all his soul and with all of his strength. And it says that there, neither before or after Josiah was there a king like him. Like, he was outstanding. Mm-hmm. And yet, the very next verse starts out by saying that nevertheless, the Lord did not turn away from the heat of his fierce anger. Mm. That doesn't sit really well with me.
Yeah.
And that's because I'm the rule follower, and I'm seeing Josiah has followed all of the rules better than anyone else ever, than any other king listed here. Right. Nobody before or after it did it quite like him. And yet God didn't answer his prayers in the way that maybe we think he should. Not only that, it said that God was still angry.
Right.
Like, how does that sit with you? I know you and I are kindred spirits in the fact that we are spreadsheet people and we are rule follower people.
Enneagram ones. Unite.
Yep. But what does that mean to you? What do you see at play here?
Yeah, so I think two things. One is, I think of that passage, I think it's in 1 Samuel, where it says, God does not look at what people look at, God looks at the heart. And so while Josiah may have been doing all the right things on the outside, perhaps his heart wasn't right. And so again, same over here. I'm a rule follower, and it's really easy for me to look at what the rules or expectations are and just do them. Like, it makes sense to me. But if you're doing them just because you should or because someone told you to, then your heart posture isn't actually right. The other thing I think about is that Josiah lived in the Old Testament. And so in those times, they were under the old covenant, right? God had given his people the 10 commandments so they knew how to live, and they were expected to follow those guidelines. But then when we go to the New Testament in Romans, it actually tells us that God gave the law to the people to prove that they could not uphold the law in and of themselves. And he sent Jesus to start a new covenant with us, which is grace. And so that, I think, is just beautiful for us to remember when we're looking at any passages in the Old Testament that are confusing or hard, or God seems like an angry God who is, punishing people for not doing the right things, is that ultimately he sent his son Jesus so that we did not have to do the right things, because he knew that we couldn't of our own strength. And so Jesus came so that we could have a relationship with God even without following all of those rules, and that we can have forgiveness and have relationship with him. And yeah, it's just a beautiful thing to remember that we're now operating under a new covenant with Jesus and his blood.
And that new covenant in particular is one that we celebrate with communion at church. And it was a communion weekend just this last weekend here. And it goes, again, like there's this passage in 1 Corinthians that we read relatively regularly when it comes to communion, and it's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And we focus on like the first half of it, but a lot of times we don't necessarily focus on the back half of it quite as much, because maybe it's just me as well. Like I'll own the fact that I'm the rule follower. So it says when you do communion, this is how you do communion. The Lord Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed, took the bread, right? We can start quoting all of that. But it doesn't get to the heart of the matter sometimes. Like that's the logistical end of things.
Right.
But the verses that come after that, it talks about how the cup is the new covenant. But when it gets into verse 26 and 27, it says, "For whenever you eat the bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he returns. So then, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. So everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For those who eat and drink without discerning the body of Christ eat and drink judgment on themselves," right? It goes to the why are we doing what we're doing? Yes, we are to take communion together, but we're supposed to do it in a way that we're turning to Christ, that we're looking to him, that we are taking the time to reflect, that we're taking the time to repent, that we're taking time to confess. And the awkward thing sometimes is that confessing is one to another as opposed to just straight up and down.
Right.
And that's a really uncomfortable experience as well.
Yeah.
But it's because we're proclaiming the good news of Jesus to a world that needs it. Even if this family meal is for the family of God, there are other people that see us doing it and don't necessarily know the heart behind all of it.
Right.
And there's one other thing that's just kind of blown me away about communion, that we're just going to keep dovetailing and go with it for a few seconds. And it's just at the beginning of this passage. And it says, where I want to make sure that I find the actual verse. In verse 23, it says, "The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks." And I was sitting there thinking about it a couple of months back. And it's something that's still on the forefront of my mind. None of what happened to Jesus was surprising to him. He knew what he was here to do. He was here to be about his Father's work. He knew the cup that was before him. He knew he was going to be crucified. He knew he was going to be betrayed. And yet at the same time, we're sitting there looking at it, and on the night Jesus knows he is about to be betrayed by one of his 12 best friends in the entire world, what does he do? He takes the time to give thanks. When's the last time we've had a heart posture of knowing we're walking through a difficult season in life, and yet we're still turning to God and saying, thank you?
Yeah.
Saying thank you, not only that you're with me, like that's the Psalm 23, I walk through the valley of shadow of death, you're right here with me, but also potentially even thanking God for the hard times.
Yeah.
Like that's a heart shift that's really difficult to grapple with.
Yeah, I would say too that you mentioned earlier confession as part of this, and confessing to one another can be really uncomfortable. But I think especially when you're in hard times, having people to confess to who know you really well, they can also then in hard times remind you what you have to be grateful for because they know you. And so I think this additional spiritual practice, or just the thread that we see in the gospel of community together, and that Jesus didn't do anything alone, and he didn't have the communion alone, he didn't have the Last Supper alone, right? And so one of the things that we can do if we're feeling like we can't have that posture of gratitude ourselves is really make sure that we have people around us who can help remind us how God has worked in our lives before and his faithfulness. And sometimes it is hard for us to see what's good about a situation that we're in if it's really hard. But when we have people around us who they can kind of be our eyes for us and can help us to remember that God is good even amidst the hard.
It's a way to journal without actually writing something down. That's actually an outstanding idea. I've never been great at journaling, but if I was better at confessing one to another, right, then there might be a little bit more of that be readily available.
It's true. Yep.
So where do we take this, right? What would we say to somebody of, let's talk about the next time we take communion,
Yeah.
right? Spoiler alert for anybody joining us here at the Compass Church. We take communion regularly once a month, and then, again on some high holidays, but it's the second Sunday of every month. But again, that could feel like following a rule.
Yeah.
How do we get to the heart of the matter of communion for people to be mindful of next time we get ready to take together?
Yeah, I think, like I said, it's having people around you, first of all, who know you really well and also are Christ followers, so that they can encourage you and, just walk with you. I have a couple friends who, if I'm really struggling to either hear from God, or if I know my flesh is, rearing up and I'm wanting to do something that I know is not aligned with the gospel, or say something that I'm not proud of, I can call them up and say, hey, I'm really struggling, can you help me? And they'll speak words of life and truth, and they'll speak words of the gospel to me and just help me to reorient myself. And so if we're doing that all the time, then when we do come to communion, we do have our hearts in a place that is more prepared and a posture that is more obedient and honoring to God. I think also I was really challenged because I grew up in a very traditional faith. And when I became an adult, we had a team that actually went around and we gave communion to one another, like around a table. And it was very intimate and different than I had ever experienced before. And so I think I would even challenge people to take communion maybe alone in your house, or take communion with your family around the dinner table, or with your small group. We have that priority of connecting in groups. And I think it's really important for us to remember that Jesus had the Last Supper and anticipated that we would make this a regular practice. So you don't have to wait for the second Sunday, right? You can incorporate communion as a practice of remembrance, and remembering what Jesus did for us on the cross and being obedient to what he asked us to do. Those would be a few things that I would say. What
and
about
I think
you?
I would add on, give yourself extra time. And that might be, if we're going through a communion moment during a service, that you wait a couple extra minutes, but maybe it's more, hey, you remember that it's the second Sunday of the month. So as you're driving into church, you're taking a little bit more intentional time to remember what we're doing and why we're doing it. To take the time to be prayerful ahead of time of, God, what is it you want to show me about myself that's not honoring you right now? Show me the people that I need to apologize to, that I need to ask for forgiveness from. To be remembering the fact that this family meal connects believers around the world and across time, that when we're taking communion together, we are sharing in the life of Jesus in the same way that the disciples were that very night. And there are so many heroes of the faith who have been doing the exact same thing for centuries in between. And it's a unifying thing. And then also just, again, making sure that we're doing things for the right reasons, not just that we're doing the right things. For me, that means spending more time in prayer. And that would be where I would land the plane. As much as any of those things, it would be spending more time in prayer, knowing what's coming, so that I can be ready to hear from God, so that I can be in the right mind and head space and heart space and the right posture. Keep going back to that word, but just to make sure that the intentions behind what's happening are more than just, this is what we're required to do, so we're doing it.
Absolutely.
This is a different kind of conversation than we've had on a Midweek in a while, and I really like it.
Thanks.
It's been fun.
It's fun, Thanks for having me.
Any parting words that you want to share with people? You've got an open mic in front of you,
gosh,
and the answer could be no.
No, I would just say I'm excited to be here and grateful for the opportunity to share today and just be behind the scenes helping with the podcast. So super fun.
Just one last spoiler alert. All of the questions that we've been doing pretty much this whole season have come from Cassie, so you can thank her for all of that. I just end up being the mouthpiece for it, so I'm better because of it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you all for joining us today. Really enjoyed having this conversation. It's something, again, personally, that's just been on my heart a lot lately, of just spiritual practices and spiritual disciplines, and communion being another one of those important ones. So hopefully there's some nugget of truth in here that you can take with you, that you can stew on, that you can resonate with a little bit more. But if there are any additional questions, you can always just let us know. Or if you want to know more about how to do a particular spiritual practice, let us know by emailing us at online@thecompass.net. We'd be happy to answer those questions as well. And we're already looking forward to what's coming up next week, because what's coming up next week is more conversations around Egypt. We're going to be joined by Anna Maria. She's got a really fun and fascinating story of leaving a dream job, going from something where she felt like God was working through her life in a very unique and specific way, and leaving it all behind, trusting that God was leading and that she would be obedient and following. So we're going to hear more of her story next time here at Midweek at the Compass.